Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going beyond the headlines to see how COVID-19 impacted Indigenous peoples all over the world.
Yeah.
We've got this really cool report called the Indigenous World 2021.
Right.
Think of it as a collection of firsthand stories and analysis from experts. It
Exactly.
really paints a picture of what happened.
It's not just the immediate effects we'll be looking at either,
Okay.
but also how the pandemic sort of magnified existing inequalities.
Yeah,
But at the same time, we see this incredible resilience from Indigenous communities.
that's right.
So we'll be unpacking all of that.
We're talking economic struggles, political representation, land rights, healthcare access. It's a lot to cover.
It is.
But we'll break it down in a way that's both informative and engaging.
Yeah. Let's start with the economic fallout.
Okay.
A lot of Indigenous communities depend on traditional practices,
Right.
like farming or raising livestock.
Yeah.
When the pandemic hit, travel restrictions and market closures really threw a wrench in things. For example,
Yeah.
pastoralists.
Right. Pastoralists.
So like in Tanzania and Burkina Faso.
Their entire livelihood revolves around livestock.
Exactly.
The report paints a very stark picture.
Yeah.
Imagine seeing the value of your life's work
Right.
suddenly plummet.
Exactly.
That's the reality they faced
Yeah.
when markets reopened.
And, it's not just about the immediate financial loss.
Right.
It affects their ability to care for their families
Yeah.
and to keep up their traditional way of life.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, with long-term consequences.
And it wasn't just pastoralists either.
No.
Imagine being an indigenous youth in Kenya
Okay.
who depends on wildlife tourism.
Right.
Suddenly, no tourists,
Yeah.
no jobs,
Yeah.
no income.
So these economic shocks really exposed a deeper issue.
Yeah.
Systemic inequalities that have existed long before the pandemic.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities often face a disadvantage when it comes to economic opportunities, and the pandemic just made things worse. It's like they were dealt a bad hand,
Right.
and then the rules of the game changed mid-play.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It really shows how we need economic recovery efforts
Yeah.
that are specifically designed
Yeah.
for the needs and challenges of indigenous communities.
But amidst these struggles,
Yeah.
there's also this amazing resilience
Right.
shown in the report.
That's what's inspiring about this.
Yeah, talk about making the best of a bad situation.
Yeah.
For example, in Indonesia,
Okay.
Indigenous organizations created what they called dignified quarantines.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of
Yeah.
collective action.
Yeah.
They didn't panic.
Right?
They focused on providing essential information and resources,
Yeah.
and that empowered their communities to adapt.
Yeah.
Think about women and youth
Yeah.
making hand sanitizer
Yeah.
from natural ingredients
That's so cool.
and sharing safety tips through video tutorials.
Yeah,
Ingenuity and action.
that's right. And we see similar things happening in Thailand.
Yeah. Communities were exchanging goods and knowledge,
Right.
creating their own safety nets.
So this shows how strong
Yeah.
Indigenous knowledge and community support systems really are.
Yeah.
These weren't just survival tactics.
No.
They were about upholding their values
Yeah.
of care and responsibility.
Seeing a testament to their strength
Yeah.
and adaptability.
Exactly.
Now, on the other hand,
Yeah.
this economic vulnerability
Uh-huh.
makes them more susceptible
Right.
to political maneuvering.
Yeah.
The report reveals a troubling trend.
Okay.
The pandemic was sometimes used as a cover
Yeah.
to further marginalize indigenous rights.
Right.
The situation with the Amazigh in Algeria is a
Yeah.
perfect example.
Okay.
They boycotted a constitutional referendum
Mm-hmm.
that they saw as oppressive.
Right.
And what happened?
Yeah.
They faced police violence
Yeah.
and limited access to information in their own language.
It's like they were battling the pandemic and
Yeah.
fighting for their basic rights.
Well,
A double whammy.
and unfortunately, this
Mm.
pattern repeats in other countries.
Yeah.
From land grabbing in Kenya
Right.
to the criminalization of indigenous activists in Indonesia.
Uh-huh.
The pandemic emboldened those who wanted to exploit indigenous lands and silence dissent.
So it brings us to land rights
Yeah.
and environmental protection,
Right?
which also came under threat.
Right.
The report has this heartbreaking story
Oh.
of the Mboro pastoralists in Cameroon.
Yeah, it's devastating.
They faced violence, displacement.
Right.
They even had their livestock confiscated.
It's basically taking away their livelihood
Yeah.
and their cultural heritage.
And in Cambodia,
Yeah.
lockdowns led to more illegal logging and land grabbing.
Right, within indigenous territory.
It's all connected.
Yeah, they're all intertwined.
Indigenous rights, environmental protection,
Mhm.
and economic security.
The pandemic showed how fragile indigenous land systems are in a lot of countries.
Right.
And even with international agreements,
Right.
like ILO Convention 169, enforcement is weak.
So communities are vulnerable.
Yeah, to exploitation.
So we see communities being resilient,
Yes.
but they're also up against powerful forces.
Yeah, and they lack support from their governments.
This brings us to healthcare disparities and access, which the report highlights. In some cases, we don't even have basic data
That's right.
on the pandemic's impact on indigenous communities.
They're being rendered invisible.
Right.
It's hard to assess their needs and advocate for them.
So it's not just about having hospitals and clinics, but also ensuring culturally sensitive care, overcoming language barriers, and addressing the challenges faced by communities in remote areas, in Guatemala. Limited access to healthcare and culturally relevant information. Left indigenous populations very vulnerable.
It raises another point that the report doesn't really touch on.
What about the mental and emotional toll?
That's huge. You can't just separate physical health from mental and emotional well-being.
Exactly.
So did the report find any positive developments in the global response to these challenges?
There were some good things. Like the increased use of virtual platforms to amplify indigenous voices at the UN.
Interesting.
This allowed for wider participation in dialogues and consultations.
So technology played a positive role in connecting people and advocating for change. Which is interesting because it can also be a tool for marginalization.
It's a double-edged sword. But even with these advancements, the pandemic exposed limitations in the existing mechanisms that are supposed to protect indigenous rights, especially when facing corporate interests and government neglect.
It really highlights the urgent need for systemic change and a stronger global response.
Absolutely.
But before we go down that road, let's look at some specific country examples.
Okay, let's start with Botswana.
Okay.
The report doesn't give us a lot of detail, but it does capture the hopes of the indigenous and minority people there.
They express a desire for widespread vaccine availability, economic recovery, and a real push for human rights and social justice.
It speaks to the universality of these basic needs, regardless of location or cultural background.
Now remember the Moboro pastoralists in Cameroon. The report gives us a devastating statistical snapshot.
It is tough to hear.
Give us the numbers.
From the beginning of the crisis to December 2020. 260 Moboro were killed.
Oh, wow.
Over 3,000 injured and 12,000 displaced.
Oh, man.
They also had to pay ransoms with millions of CFA francs.
And they lost thousands of cattle.
It's basically stripping them of their livelihood and cultural heritage.
This is a horrific example of how conflict and instability make indigenous communities even more vulnerable. We need peacekeeping efforts and targeted humanitarian aid.
Absolutely.
Now, the report highlights a glimmer of hope. Amidst the ongoing challenges in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
In the DRC.
Tell me more.
They're proposing a new law to protect and promote the rights of indigenous Pygmy peoples.
That's encouraging.
It
shows that progress is possible, even in difficult environments.
It's important to recognize these positive developments, but also to remember that we need accountability and actual implementation. A law on paper is only effective if it leads to real change.
Now, the report paints a concerning picture of indigenous communities in the Tigray region of Ethiopia.
The situation there is incredibly complex. Sounded dangerous.
Eritrean troops have been involved in the armed conflict. And armed groups have attacked refugee camps. Putting Eritrean refugees at risk.
Including those who identify as indigenous.
The report mentions abductions, killings. Even forced returns to Eritrea.
It's another reminder of how conflict displaces people. And creates fear and uncertainty. Humanitarian organizations are so important in providing aid and protection in these situations.
And this conflict adds another layer of difficulty to the broader challenges faced by indigenous peoples in Ethiopia.
especially pastoralists and hunter-gatherers.
Right. They make up a large portion of the population.
And they often live in the Ethiopian lowlands, which are increasingly sought after by foreign investors.
Yeah, for land grabbing.
It pushes them further to the margins.
Yeah, limiting their access to resources and basic services.
Their perseverance
is remarkable.
Now let's look at Kenya.
Okay.
The report highlights ongoing challenges related to land rights and resource management.
They talk about the Community Land Act, which aims to secure community land ownership. But progress has been slow, leaving communities vulnerable.
The report gives the example of the Endoroy community in Lake Bogoria.
Right. They're still waiting for their land to be registered.
Wow.
Even though the African Commission on Human and People's Rights ruled in their favor.
It shows the gap between legal recognition and actual implementation.
Right.
We need to keep advocating and putting pressure on governments to honor their commitments.
It also mentions the Ogiek community. They're dealing with evictions and displacement.
From their ancestral lands in the Mau Forest.
It seems conservation efforts sometimes come at the expense of indigenous rights.
It's about finding that balance
between conservation goals and the rights and livelihoods of indigenous peoples.
The report talks about a promising initiative in Kenya using traditional ecological knowledge to fight invasive plant species.
Interesting. Tell me more.
They're using indigenous plants, like Lantana camara, to manage the spread of Prosopis juliflora, which has been a real problem on grazing lands.
So it's not just about preserving tradition. It's about incorporating it into modern conservation efforts.
We need to go beyond a purely Western scientific approach. And embrace more holistic and inclusive approach.
Now let's look at Libya. The report describes political exclusion and discrimination against the Amazigh and Tubu communities.
They've been historically marginalized, facing barriers in access to basic services, employment, and positions of authority. And these challenges continued despite political turmoil and the pandemic.
The report highlights that they weren't even invited to inter-Libyan meetings to try to resolve the country's crisis.
They lack representation and a voice in shaping their own future.
It's concerning, given the political instability.
But they have shown resilience.
How?
They were successful in limiting the spread of COVID-19.
That's great.
They did it by setting up their own services, organizing lockdowns, and using traditional medicine.
It shows their ability to adapt. And the importance of self-determination and community-led solutions.
This is a good lesson for policymakers. Recognize and support indigenous communities' right to self-governance. It can lead to better outcomes for everyone.
Now let's go to Namibia. The report gives us a glimpse into the lives of the Sand communities.
They continue to face challenges with land rights, cultural recognition, and economic opportunities.
The Sands are one of the oldest cultures in the world. Their connection to their ancestral lands is fundamental to their identity.
But they've been systematically dispossessed of their land.
Leading to poverty, that marginalization.
The Hyom Sand community was given a small piece of land, but it wasn't nearly enough to support their traditional livelihoods.
They rely on hunting and gathering.
Which
needs a lot of space.
It's not enough to just give them small plots of land without thinking about their cultural and economic needs. Their way of life is tied to the land.
The report also mentions the Komani Sand community. They're facing criminal charges for hunting on their ancestral land.
So their traditional practices are being criminalized.
It undermines their cultural identity and their ability to sustain themselves.
It's a reminder of the ongoing fight for recognition and justice.
Let's continue looking at specific country examples. Next up is South Africa.
South Africa has this really complex story of progress and setbacks when it comes to indigenous rights. The report gives us some fascinating insights into the ongoing challenges and triumphs. But first, let's take a quick break, and then we'll jump right back in.
Sounds good.
South Africa's journey with indigenous rights is it's kind of complicated.
Okay.
The report shows both progress and persistent challenges.
Okay, so give us an example.
Well, for instance, the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act of 2019 was a big step toward recognizing the leadership of indigenous communities.
That sounds promising.
Yeah, it seems like they're moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach to governance. But as we've seen in other countries, just passing a law isn't enough.
Right.
The real test is implementation, making sure these laws actually lead to change.
So it's about giving communities a real voice in decisions that affect them.
Now let's shift our focus to Tanzania.
Okay, Tanzania.
The report highlights the struggles of several indigenous groups, like the Hadzabe and Aki, who are hunter-gatherer communities, and pastoralist groups, like the Barabe and Maasai.
They face a lot of challenges.
Yeah, from land insecurity to not having enough political representation.
Now, the Maasai are known for their culture and connection to their land.
What does the report say about them?
Yeah.
Well, they're facing a new threat. A proposed soda ash factory in their ancestral home.
Wow.
The Nguruka Basin.
The government's saying it'll bring economic benefits.
Right. But the report is concerned about the impact on the Maasai's livelihoods and the environment.
It's that classic dilemma. Economic development versus indigenous rights.
Where the short-term gains often overshadow the long-term costs.
And the report specifically mentions the potential for pollution from this factory.
It could affect the Nguruka Basin.
Yeah, but also nearby ecosystems.
Oh, wow.
Like the Ngorongoro Conservation Area and the Serengeti National Park.
Environmental impacts often go beyond borders.
Absolutely.
So are those short-term economic gains worth it?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah.
Policymakers and developers really need to think about that.
Okay.
Now, let's go to Tunisia.
Okay, Tunisia.
The report shines a light on the Amazigh community.
Yeah, they have a rich and ancient culture.
Right.
What's their situation like in Tunisia?
Well, despite their long history there,
Yeah.
the government hasn't fully recognized them.
It's like they're invisible.
Right.
Yeah.
But there have been some glimmers of hope.
After years of advocating, the government finally got rid of this old rule that banned parents from giving their children non-Arabic first names.
It's a small step.
Yeah.
But it's a step towards recognition.
It shows that persistence and advocacy can make a difference.
Yeah.
Even if change is slow.
Okay, speaking of change.
Yeah.
Let's turn our attention to Uganda.
Okay, Uganda?
The report gives us an update on the Batwa,
right?
An indigenous group that's been historically marginalized.
They were evicted from their homes in the 1990s to make way for national parks.
So they lost access to resources.
Yeah, and they're facing poverty.
The report highlights their fight for land rights and recognition.
Uganda hasn't even ratified ILO Convention 169.
That's disheartening.
Yeah, it's like their rights are constantly ignored.
But there is some good news. Community-based organizations are emerging to empower the Batwa.
That's great.
And advocate for their rights.
Yeah, they're focusing on education, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
It's inspiring to see them taking charge, even when facing these challenges.
Now let's move on to Zimbabwe.
Okay, Zimbabwe.
The report highlights the San people.
Yeah.
They're facing increasing pressure on their lands and livelihoods.
The San rely on hunting and gathering.
Yeah.
Are they facing similar challenges?
Yes, they are. To the Batwa when it comes to land rights. They're dealing with restrictions and displacement because of conservation efforts, mining operations, and agricultural expansion. The report specifically talks about trophy hunting in Shalasho district, where the San have been excluded from decisions.
So their lands are being taken away and their practices are criminalized.
Yeah, a double whammy.
Yeah.
It impacts their food security and their cultural identity.
The report also notes the challenges with land rights and the lack of recognition of the Skondra's indigenous peoples.
It seems like there's a disconnect between the laws and the reality for indigenous communities.
Now, amidst these challenges, there are stories of resilience and hope.
Let's shift our focus to Asia, starting with Bangladesh.
Bangladesh has a complex social and political landscape.
It does.
What about indigenous peoples there?
Well, they make up a small but important part of the population. And they face a lot of challenges.
Like what?
Discrimination, land dispossession, even violence.
The Chittagong Hill Tracts region?
Yeah, that's a particular area of concern.
Why?
There's been conflict and land disputes there.
Okay.
They signed the Chittagong Hill Tracts Peace Accord in 1997 to address these issues.
So even with agreements, change can be slow.
And unfortunately, indigenous communities in the Chittagong Hill Tracts continue to face land grabbing, militarization, and human rights violations.
The report also notes the impact of the pandemic on indigenous communities in Bangladesh.
They had a hard time getting health care and essential services.
So they're bearing the brunt of the crisis.
It's a global pattern.
Now let's move on to Cambodia.
Okay, Cambodia.
The report isn't very optimistic.
No.
Indigenous peoples there are facing increasing pressure on their lands and resources.
Cambodia has a lot of biodiversity and natural resources.
What's driving this pressure on indigenous lands?
Well, there are a few things. Logging, mining, and agribusiness expansion.
So these all lead to displacement, land grabbing, and environmental degradation.
And the pandemic likely made things worse. The report says that lockdowns and restrictions led to more illegal logging and land grabbing.
Within indigenous territories.
It's tragic how crises create opportunities for exploitation. It pushes vulnerable communities further to the margins.
Are there any positive developments in the report?
Sadly, the report mostly focuses on the challenges. It points out that indigenous communities struggle to get justice. They often don't have legal recognition of their land rights.
And existing laws are weak.
And not enforced.
So laws on paper don't always translate into real protection.
Okay, let's move on to China. The report doesn't give us much. But it does talk about the Tibet Autonomous Region, where the government is pushing big infrastructure projects and assimilation policies.
Tibet has a unique cultural and spiritual heritage.
What are the implications of these policies?
These projects often come at a cost to indigenous rights and cultural heritage.
For example, they're building the Sichuan-Tibet Railway, which is going to have a big impact on indigenous communities.
These large-scale projects can lead to displacement and environmental damage.
The report highlights the lack of transparency and consultation with indigenous communities.
Their voices aren't being heard.
Their concerns are dismissed.
Economic development shouldn't come at the cost of human rights and cultural diversity. Let's move on to India.
India.
They have a large and diverse indigenous population.
Often called scheduled tribes.
Do they face similar challenges?
Yes, they do, to those we've seen in other countries.
Okay.
The report highlights their struggle for recognition and rights.
They still face discrimination and violence.
The Indian government actually voted for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Okay.
But they've been slow to put it into practice.
So another disconnect between international commitments and national actions.
One of the biggest challenges is the lack of restoration of alienated tribal land.
There are laws to prevent the sale of indigenous lands.
But they're not very effective. And land grabbing continues.
So the laws are there, but they're not enforced.
The report gives an example of 420 indigenous families in Kerala who found out their land was illegally leased to a construction company.
So they had to fight back.
Through legal action and protests to challenge this.
And on top of that, there's the conflict between the government and Maoist insurgents.
This has been devastating for indigenous communities.
Being caught in the crossfire adds another layer of vulnerability.
Let's move on to Indonesia. The report describes a concerning trend of criminalization and violence against indigenous peoples.
Indonesia has a long history of conflict
between
indigenous communities and the government.
Especially when it comes to land rights.
Does the report talk about the current situation?
It does. Even though there's some legal recognition of indigenous rights, those rights are often violated. The report gives examples of indigenous communities facing criminal charges and violence.
For simply defending their land.
For protecting their forests from being cleared.
It's the tragic that they're being punished for protecting their land.
The report also highlights the situation in West Papua. Indigenous communities there facing human rights violations.
The conflict between the Indonesian government and separatist groups has had a devastating impact.
It's led to displacement, violence, and restrictions on their freedom.
So political conflict and militarization can really make indigenous communities more vulnerable.
Let's move on to Japan now.
Well, Japan.
The report focuses on the Ainu people.
Yeah, they've long been marginalized.
They have a distinct culture and language, but they've faced assimilation policies.
Have there been any efforts to change this?
There have been some positive developments.
Okay.
The Upapoi National Ainu Museum and Park opened in 2020.
Oh, that's good.
It aims to promote Ainu culture and history.
So that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, but there's still work to be done.
Okay.
A key issue is that Japan still doesn't legally recognize the Ainu as indigenous peoples.
It's like their identity is being questioned.
Right.
Yeah.
And that makes it harder for them to assert their rights to land, resources, and self-determination.
The report also mentions their struggle to get back their ancestral remains, which are held in museums and universities across Japan.
It's a sensitive issue that shows the need for more respect for Ainu cultural heritage.
Now, what about Laos? What does the report say about indigenous peoples there?
They have trouble accessing information and services.
Especially during the pandemic.
A lot of indigenous peoples in Laos live in remote areas and face language barriers. So it's hard for them to get the information they need. The pandemic made this even worse because information about COVID-19 wasn't available in their languages.
So they were dealing with isolation and a language barrier during a global health crisis.
The report also points out the economic impact of the pandemic on indigenous livelihoods.
Travel restrictions and lockdown.
Yeah, they disrupted their traditional practices and income-generating activities.
So they're particularly vulnerable to disruptions like pandemics or climate change.
Now let's move on to Malaysia.
Okay, Malaysia.
The report focuses on the Orang Asli, the indigenous peoples of peninsular Malaysia.
Malaysia is a relatively developed country. Yeah. Are they facing the same kinds of challenges?
Sadly, yes.
Okay.
Even though their constitution recognizes their rights, the Orang Asli still experience land dispossession and displacement.
And they're often excluded from decision-making.
Their report mentions the conflict over land rights in Kelantan, where Orang Asli communities are protesting against logging and plantations.
So economic interests often win out over indigenous rights.
And it's not just land rights. They also face discrimination and prejudice. Their cultural practices are often looked down on.
So legal recognition isn't enough.
No.
We need to change societal attitudes and address systemic discrimination.
Now let's move on to Myanmar.
Okay.
The report describes a very volatile situation, especially for indigenous communities in conflict areas.
Like Rakhine and Kachin states.
Myanmar has been in turmoil for years.
What's it like for indigenous communities there?
It's really bad.
Okay.
The civil war and human rights violations have had a terrible impact. They've been displaced and they've experienced violence. And the pandemic made things worse by limiting access to healthcare and services.
So they're dealing with multiple crises at once.
Right. Conflict, displacement, and a pandemic.
The report talks about the Rohingya, a Muslim minority group in Rakhine State.
They've been persecuted by the Myanmar military.
They've been denied citizenship and basic rights.
Many have fled to Bangladesh.
It's a tragic example.
It is.
Of ethnic and religious discrimination leading to human rights abuses.
It's not just the Rohingya either. Other indigenous communities like the Karen, Kachin, and Shan are also caught in the conflict.
They're dealing with land dispossession and violence.
It's clear that conflict and militarization have terrible consequences for indigenous peoples.
It threatens their safety, their livelihoods, and their culture.
Now let's move on to Nepal.
Okay, Nepal.
The political landscape is changing here.
Yeah, Nepal has gone through some big changes.
It has.
How have these changes affected indigenous peoples?
Well, Nepal has made progress in some areas. They adopted a new constitution in 2015, which recognizes the country's diversity.
But the implementation has been uneven.
Yeah, indigenous communities still face challenges.
That's good intentions, but not always good results.
The report specifically talks about the Tharu community. They've been protesting against a hydropower project that's threatening their land.
Their protests have been met with violence and repression.
It's another case of development projects being imposed without consent.
Leading to conflict and human rights violations.
The pandemic also made things harder.
Right.
For indigenous communities in Nepal.
They had trouble accessing healthcare and other services.
So we need to address systemic discrimination and make sure everyone has equal access.
Now let's move on to the Philippines.
Okay.
The report talks about human rights violations and militarization in indigenous territories.
Right.
How has this conflict affected indigenous communities?
Well, they've been fighting for recognition of their land rights and self-determination.
Okay.
But they face threats from many sides.
Like what?
Mining companies, logging operations, and agribusiness plantations.
So they're fighting a battle on multiple fronts.
Exactly.
The report says the government's counterinsurgency campaign has led to more militarization
in indigenous territories.
Okay.
This has caused human rights violations, displacement, and restrictions on their freedom.
It seems like counterinsurgency operations can be an excuse for human rights abuses.
The report specifically mentions the Lumad.
In Mindanao.
They've been targeted by the military and accused of supporting insurgents. Their schools and communities have been attacked, and many have been forced to flee.
It's another instance of indigenous communities getting caught in the crossfire.
And as we've seen before, access to justice is a major problem. They often lack legal representation and face intimidation. We need stronger legal frameworks and independent monitoring.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's look at Thailand.
Okay, Thailand.
The report gives an overview of the situation for indigenous people.
Who are often called hill tribes.
What are the biggest challenges they face?
They have issues with citizenship, land rights, and discrimination.
Even though they have a long history in Thailand, many indigenous groups aren't recognized as citizens. This makes it hard for them to access education and healthcare.
So their existence as citizens is being questioned.
The report says that the process for getting citizenship is difficult and discriminatory.
Wow.
They often have to give up their cultural identity.
So it's another attempt to erase indigenous identities and force assimilation.
And they also have trouble securing their land rights. Their customary land tenure systems aren't legally recognized.
So their lands are often taken.
For development projects or conservation efforts.
Again, economic interests often come first.
The report mentions the conflict over land rights in the Salween River Basin. Indigenous Karen communities are resisting a dam that threatens their way of life.
And their protests have been met with violence. It shows the importance of consent for any development projects that impact indigenous lands.
And of course, the pandemic made things worse. Indigenous communities in Thailand also had trouble getting healthcare and other essential services.
It highlights the need for accessible healthcare and economic safety nets that take their unique vulnerabilities into account.
Okay, now let's move on to the Americas. Starting with Bolivia.
Bolivia has been a leader in recognizing indigenous rights. What's the current situation there?
Well, Bolivia has made some progress.
Okay.
They adopted a new constitution in 2009 that recognizes indigenous autonomy.
But even with good laws, it's not always easy to put them into practice.
The report talks about the political turmoil in 2020 after President Evo Morales was ousted.
That was a big moment. How did it affect indigenous communities?
Well, the interim government faced accusations of human rights violations. Indigenous protesters who supported Morales
were targeted.
So political instability can lead to human rights abuses.
Especially for marginalized groups.
And the pandemic just added to the challenges.
Indigenous communities in Bolivia also struggled to get health care.
It's a common theme in this report. Crises make things worse for those who are already marginalized.
Now let's move to Brazil.
Okay, Brazil.
The report paints a bleak picture.
Brazil has a huge indigenous population.
It does.
What are the threats they're facing?
One major factor is the political climate. Under President Bolsonaro, there's been more land grabbing and violence.
Bolsonaro has been openly hostile.
He has.
Towards indigenous rights and environmental protection.
And this has emboldened those who want to exploit their land.
So government policies can either help or hurt indigenous communities.
The report also talks about healthcare access.
Yeah.
It's difficult for indigenous communities in Brazil. Yeah, because of their remote locations?
Yeah, they have limited access to transportation.
Right.
And they face language barriers.
These are all factors that make them more vulnerable.
The report specifically mentions the impact of COVID-19 in the Amazon. It spread quickly there because of limited healthcare and lack of information.
It shows how systemic inequalities can have devastating consequences.
Okay, let's shift gears to Chile, where indigenous peoples are fighting for recognition.
Chile has a long history.
It does.
Of indigenous activism.
Right.
So have there been any positive changes?
There has been some progress. Chile adopted a new law in 2008 that recognizes indigenous peoples and their rights.
But the implementation has been uneven.
Yeah, indigenous communities still face challenges.
So legal recognition doesn't always mean real change.
The report highlights the protests that happened in Chile in 2019. Indigenous communities were a big part of those protests. They were demanding recognition and an end to discrimination.
It shows their commitment to shaping their country's future.
And of course, the pandemic added to the challenges.
Indigenous communities in Chile also struggled to get health care and essential services. So we need to focus on addressing systemic inequalities and ensuring equal access to resources.
Now let's turn to Colombia.
Okay, Colombia.
The report describes a concerning trend of violence against indigenous peoples.
Colombia has a long history of armed conflict.
It does.
Did the peace accord bring any positive changes?
It's a mixed bag. While the peace accord was a good step, it didn't really address the root causes of the violence.
So the conflict continues.
Yeah, in many areas.
The report mentions the number of indigenous leaders who have been killed.
It's alarming.
Yeah.
They were killed for defending their land.
So achieving peace means addressing the root causes of the conflict.
Like land dispossession and discrimination.
Access to justice is still a problem.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities in Colombia often lack legal help and face intimidation. We need a justice system that holds people accountable and protects indigenous rights.
Let's move on to Costa Rica now.
Okay, Costa Rica.
A country known for its environmental policies and human rights record.
But what about indigenous communities there?
Well, Costa Rica is praised for its environmentalism, but indigenous communities.
Expert. Mexico has a rich history and cultural heritage, but indigenous communities have often been marginalized and discriminated against. Has there been any progress in addressing these issues?
Well, Mexico's constitution does recognize indigenous peoples, and there are laws in place, but the reality is indigenous communities still face a lot of challenges like discrimination, poverty, and human rights violations. They make up about 12% of the population, and the report highlights the ongoing issues they have in accessing healthcare, education, and other basic services.
It's like a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, you said it.
They can't get out of poverty because they don't have access to these essential things.
The report points out some really specific issues.
Okay, like what?
Like high rates of poverty and malnutrition among indigenous children. And limited access to education in their native languages.
So addressing these systemic inequalities is key.
Absolutely.
We need to ensure everyone has equal access to resources and opportunities.
I completely agree.
And as we've seen in other countries, the pandemic just made these existing inequalities even worse.
Indigenous communities in Mexico also face those same barriers.
Right, like accessing healthcare and essential services.
Exactly, and their livelihoods were disrupted too.
It really exposes the flaws in our system.
Yeah, it shows where the cracks are.
And who falls through them.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift our focus to Nicaragua now.
Okay, Nicaragua.
It's a country with a pretty complex and troubled history.
Yeah, it has been through a lot.
So how have these events affected indigenous communities?
They've been hit hard.
Okay.
They face challenges with land rights, political participation, and they even experience violence.
The report highlights a conflict between indigenous communities and the government.
Right, over land rights and autonomy.
They're demanding recognition of their ancestral territories.
Yeah, and the right to govern themselves.
But they're facing resistance.
Yeah, the government is pushing for development projects and land concessions.
Which threaten their way of life.
Exactly.
It's that same tension between development and indigenous rights that we've seen elsewhere.
You're seeing a pattern here.
Sadly, yes.
The report specifically mentions the Mayanya and Mosquito communities. They've been experiencing increased violence and displacement
because of land invasion
by settlers and armed groups.
Wow.
And they're accusing the government of not doing enough to protect them.
That's a serious claim.
It is.
Governments have a responsibility to protect everyone from violence and displacement.
And sadly, the pandemic didn't help.
Right.
Indigenous communities in Nicaragua also struggled with healthcare and essential services.
So we need a better approach to crisis response.
Yeah, one that considers everyone.
Now let's talk about Panama.
Okay, Panama.
They've made progress in recognizing indigenous rights.
Right.
Panama has those unique comarcas.
Yeah, the indigenous autonomous regions.
So what's the situation there?
It's a mixed bag.
Okay.
Panama has a diverse indigenous population, and while there has been progress, there are still challenges.
The report mentions a positive development, though.
Okay, what's that?
The NotebookLM community finally got legal recognition of their territory as a comarca.
That's amazing.
It happened in 2020.
It shows what indigenous activism can achieve.
Right. They never gave up.
Exactly.
But the report also says that other indigenous communities in Panama still face challenges with things like land rights and access to services.
They talk about the Barro Blanco hydroelectric dam project.
Okay.
It's impacted the Ngebe-Bugle community.
They've been protesting for years, demanding compensation and a say in decisions that affect them.
It just goes to show that development projects need to be done right.
Right. With indigenous participation.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, there can be devastating consequences.
And the pandemic, unsurprisingly, added to their challenges.
Indigenous communities in Panama also had trouble accessing health care.
We have to address those underlying inequalities to make communities more resilient.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to Paraguay.
Okay, Paraguay.
They have a smaller indigenous population. Right.
But they still face significant challenges.
Okay, what are the main issues?
Land rights, discrimination, and poverty.
The report talks about their struggle to get back their ancestral lands.
Yeah, those lands were taken from them a long time ago.
It's the lasting impact of colonialism.
It really is.
It's keeping them marginalized.
The report mentions the IWGIA community.
Yeah.
They're one of the last uncontacted groups in the Americas.
Wow.
Deforestation is a big threat to them.
Right.
It could wipe out their culture.
They have the right to exist.
Absolutely.
Governments need to protect them.
Yes, and the report also notes the challenges they have with accessing basic services like healthcare and education.
So we need policies that address their specific needs.
Okay, now let's move on to Peru.
Okay, Peru.
They have a large and diverse indigenous population that's been fighting for their rights.
Peru has a long history.
It does.
With a strong indigenous presence. What does the report say about the current situation?
Yeah.
Well, indigenous people make up about 25% of Peru's population.
Wow. That's a significant portion.
It is.
Okay, so what's going on?
They've been fighting for recognition and autonomy, and the country has made some progress, but they still face challenges.
Like what?
Land rights,
extractive
industries, and political participation.
So even with progress, the fight continues.
The report highlights the conflict over mining and oil drilling.
Right, in the Amazon.
Indigenous communities are worried about the impact on their environment and their health.
It's a global issue.
Yeah.
Balancing economic interests with indigenous rights and environmental protection.
The report talks about the Wampus Nation.
Yeah, they declared autonomy in 2015.
To protect their territory.
Exactly.
From extractive industries.
They're taking control of their own destiny.
But the pandemic created more problems.
Indigenous communities in Peru had trouble accessing healthcare.
Especially those in remote areas.
It shows how important it is to have healthcare systems that work for everyone.
Okay, let's move on to Suriname.
Okay.
The report talks about political changes there and how they're affecting indigenous and tribal peoples. There was a big political shift in 2020.
Yeah. The ruling party lost power.
After decades,
right,
the new government says they want better relationships with indigenous communities.
But we'll have to wait and see.
Right. Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly.
Let's talk about Venezuela now.
Venezuela.
The report is pretty concerning.
Yeah.
It talks about the challenges indigenous communities are facing, especially with illegal mining.
It's a bad combination.
Yeah, the country's unstable and indigenous communities are suffering.
The report highlights how illegal mining is impacting their territories.
Like deforestation and water contamination.
Yeah, and social disruption.
We need stronger environmental laws.
And we need to protect indigenous land rights.
The report focuses on the IWGIA people.
Okay.
Their territory has been overrun by illegal miners.
Wow.
Backed by armed groups.
It's a dangerous situation.
It is.
Those communities must be terrified.
Indigenous organizations are trying to get the government to step in.
That's good.
They've even organized a blockade.
Wow.
To protect their land.
But that's risky.
It is. Indigenous leaders are being threatened.
It's inspiring and terrifying at the same time.
It shows how much is at stake for Indigenous communities.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. We've seen progress, but also immense challenges.
And the fight continues.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Indigenous World 2021 is just a snapshot.
Yeah, of a moment in time.
So what can we do to help?
We can support Indigenous-led organizations, raise awareness, and advocate for change.
And maybe we can learn from Indigenous knowledge.
What if they hold the answers to building a better world?
It's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
We hope this has been eye-opening.